The Covina Massacre. On Christmas Eve, 2008, the small town of Covina, California, was preparing for a holiday celebration that would end in unimaginable horror. It was meant to be a joyous family gathering, a time to give thanks and share laughter. But for one family, this Christmas would become a nightmare. The Ortega family was hosting their annual Christmas Eve party. Children played in the corner while adults chatted and exchanged gifts, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Among them was a familiar guest, Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, a former son-in-law. Although his marriage to Sylvia Ortega had ended in divorce, he had been invited to the gathering, hoping to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But the man who walked through the front door was not the familiar face everyone expected. Pardo arrived dressed as Santa Claus. Underneath the costume, Pardo carried 2 handguns and a homemade flamethrower. Within minutes of entering the home, Pardo began his rampage. He shot and killed 9 members of the Ortega family, including Sylvia, her parents, her brother, and her children. The house erupted in gunfire and chaos, but Pardo wasn't finished yet. As the victims lay dying or desperately trying to flee, he set the house on fire using the flamethrower. Those who managed to escape the inferno were left traumatized, and the flames consumed everything in their path. By the time firefighters arrived, the home was a charred shell, and 8 members of the family were confirmed dead. One woman, though severely burned, survived the attack, but she later died from her injuries. Bruce Pardo's cold, calculated plan was far from over. After carrying out the massacre, he fled the scene, but the damage was already done. Pardo eventually ended his own life by shooting himself, but the tragedy of Covina would forever remain in the hearts of those who lost loved ones that night. The Italian Hall Disaster. On Christmas Eve, 1913, the Italian Hall in Calumet, Michigan, was alive with excitement as striking miners and their families gathered for a holiday party. What began as a night of joy and celebration tragically ended as one of the darkest moments in U.S. labor history. At some point during the evening, someone yelled, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" though no fire had actually started. In the panic, the crowd surged toward the exit, but the doors swung inward, trapping nearly 300 people inside. Among the chaos, 73 people, mostly women and children, were crushed to death in the stampede. Among the 73 lives lost that night, one of the most heartbreaking stories is that of the Rinaldi family. The family had traveled miles to attend the holiday party in the Italian Hall, hoping to bring some Christmas cheer to their children. As the stampede began after the false alarm of a fire, Maria Rinaldi, a mother of 3, was with her 2 youngest children, her 6-year-old son, Antonio, and her 4-year-old daughter, Rosa. In the panic, Maria tried to protect them, but as the crowd surged, she was knocked to the ground. Maria was crushed underfoot, and in the confusion, her 2 children were separated from her. Antonio and Rosa were later found dead, crushed against the wall by the force of the crowd. Their bodies were discovered together, hugging each other in their final moments of life. Maria survived, but her family was lost that night. Boxing Day Tsunami, December 26, 2004. A day that began with holiday cheer turned into one of the deadliest disasters in modern history. Without warning, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck beneath the Indian Ocean, just off the coast of Sumatra. Within minutes, a colossal tsunami surged across 14 countries, wiping out entire towns in its path. The waves reached heights of over 100 feet, obliterating everything in their wake. Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and Indonesia were hit hardest, with over 230,000 lives lost and millions left homeless. Families were torn apart as the sea swallowed villages. On Thailand's Khao Lak Beach, a family of 4 was vacationing when the tsunami struck. The parents clung to their 2 children as the water engulfed them. But the force was too great. Despite their desperate efforts, both children were swept away. Days later, the parents found their bodies miles apart, a cruel reminder of the tsunami's merciless power. Dahisar Bridge Disaster. One of the most tragic incidents that occurred during Christmas time was the 1963 Dahisar Bridge disaster in Mumbai, India. This incident, while not directly a result of the holiday season, happened on Christmas Eve, with tragic consequences for many families. The Dahisar Bridge, a vital link for commuters, collapsed suddenly as a massive crowd of people crossed it during the evening rush hour. The bridge, already weakened by years of use and neglect, was unable to bear the weight of the crowd. Thousands of people, many of them returning from Christmas celebrations and family gatherings, were suddenly plunged into the river below when the bridge collapsed under the strain. The death toll was devastating. Estimates suggest that over 200 people lost their lives that evening, with many others injured and left stranded. The scene was chaotic, with people trapped in the debris, struggling to survive in the icy waters. The loss of so many innocent lives left the community shattered, and the event became a symbol of the tragic consequences of poor infrastructure and neglect. Christmas Eve, landslide. Christmas Eve, 1975. In the picturesque town of Ancona, Italy, Families were preparing for a night of celebration, but as the clock struck 9 p.m., the earth beneath their feet gave way. A massive landslide tore through the hillside, burying homes and families under tons of rock and mud. The landslide was triggered by weeks of relentless rain, which weakened the already unstable terrain. Entire streets disappeared in an instant, leaving 29 people dead and dozens more injured. One of the most heartbreaking stories was that of a young boy, Marco, who was pulled alive from the rubble after 12 hours, only to find out that he was the sole survivor of his family. The Tangshan coal mine explosion. Christmas Eve, 1960. In the Tangshan coal mine of China's Shanxi province, workers were preparing to finish their shifts and return home. But at 7 p.m., a deadly explosion ripped through the mine's tunnels, trapping hundreds underground. The blast was caused by a buildup of methane gas, ignited by a single spark deep within the mine. Over 682 miners lost their lives in what remains one of the deadliest mining disasters in history. Families waited for days, hoping for news of survivors, but rescue crews were only able to recover bodies. Wei Zhang, a 38-year-old father of 3, he had just sent his eldest son to college that year, only to never return home himself. For the families left behind, Christmas became a day of mourning rather than celebration. But mining disasters weren't the only tragedies to strike on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve, 2013. A quiet evening in a small apartment building in Manhattan quickly turned into chaos. At around 6 p.m., a gas leak caused a devastating explosion, ripping through the structure and setting it ablaze. The explosion killed 8 people, including a family of 4 who had just gathered to exchange Christmas gifts. Witnesses described the scene as hellish, with flames shooting through the building and debris raining down onto the street below. One neighbor, Maria, recalled hearing a loud bang and running outside, only to see her childhood friend's apartment engulfed in flames. Firefighters worked tirelessly to control the blaze, rescuing as many as they could. The 1959 Kishtim disaster. The Kishtim disaster occurred in the Soviet Union, at the Mayak nuclear complex, located in the Ural Mountains. Though the Soviet Union had long been developing nuclear technology, what most didn't know was that this facility was a ticking time bomb, handling highly radioactive materials in poor conditions, with little regard for the safety of those working there. On December 12, 1959, the nightmare began. An explosion occurred at one of the tanks containing highly radioactive waste, which was stored improperly. The explosion sent a radioactive cloud into the air, releasing deadly levels of radiation into the environment. But this was just the beginning. The nearest village, Kishtim, and other nearby settlements were completely unaware of the impending disaster. In the days following the explosion, people began to feel sick, coughing, vomiting, and experiencing severe burns on their skin. But the true horror was only beginning to reveal itself. Children, carefree and oblivious, played in the snow, unaware that the very air they breathed was filled with deadly radioactive particles. In the days that followed, they began showing signs of radiation sickness, coughing, vomiting, and suffering from horrific burns as radiation poisoned their bodies. One mother, desperate to save her son, took him to a local doctor after he began showing signs of radiation sickness. His skin, once smooth and healthy, now peeled away, revealing raw, painful burns. The doctor, unable to recognize the cause and could only watch as the child's condition worsened, the radiation slowly and relentlessly consuming him from the inside out. Within weeks, several children from the surrounding villages had died. Their small, innocent bodies couldn't withstand the lethal effects of the radiation, and their deaths were the result of a tragic ignorance, both by the authorities who failed to act and by a public unaware of the nuclear peril they faced. Even the doctors were unprepared. They couldn't recognize the signs of radiation sickness, and soon, they too began to fall ill. The Soviet Union's authorities kept the disaster under wraps, hiding the true scale of the tragedy. Years later, the full extent of the Kishtim disaster was finally revealed. Many families were forced to leave their homes behind, never to return. The Kishtim disaster left thousands dead, many more exposed to radiation. The Great Christmas Flood. Christmas Eve, 1717. Europe was gripped by one of the worst winter floods in its history. What began as a typical winter storm quickly escalated into a catastrophe as the rivers in the Netherlands, Germany, and parts of France began to overflow. Entire villages were swallowed by the rising water, and the Netherlands, being low-lying, suffered the most. Homes were torn apart, bridges collapsed, and desperate families sought refuge wherever they could. But the floodwaters continued to rise. In the chaos, a father named Willem de Vries and his 2 young children fought against the flood, racing toward higher ground. The cold, fast-moving water pulled at their feet, threatening to sweep them away. Willem, unable to swim, clutched his children tightly, urging them to move faster, but the flood was merciless. As they approached a small hill, The water surged violently. Willem's heart pounded as the current pulled him further away from the safety. He could see the hill just ahead, but the waters were rising too quickly. In a final act of desperation, he pushed his children toward the top of the hill, telling them to run and shouting at them to stay safe. But Willem was not strong enough. The current overtook him, pulling him under the freezing waters. His cries for help were drowned out by the roar of the flood as he was dragged deeper into the cold, merciless river. His children, too frightened to look back, reached the top of the hill, their eyes wide with shock and fear. They never saw their father again. The floodwaters claimed him that night, leaving behind a family broken by loss. His last moments were spent trying to protect them, and yet he couldn't reach the safety that might have saved him. By morning, the flood had left over 100 people dead, and countless others were left grieving. 1975 Santa Claus Massacre. The incident occurred during a Christmas event at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries factory, where employees and their families gathered for a Christmas celebration. A man, disguised as Santa Claus, who had been hired to entertain the children, was part of the event. However, in a shocking twist, this man, who appeared to be a jolly figure bringing joy and gifts, began a mass shooting that resulted in multiple fatalities and injuries. The assailant, armed with a firearm, attacked employees and children at the event, resulting in 11 deaths and many injuries. He had been an employee at the factory and had planned the attack to seek revenge for a personal grievance he held. The fact that this tragedy took place during a Christmas celebration, where the figure of Santa Claus is supposed to represent joy and warmth, made it even more heartbreaking. If you like this video, please like, and if you want to see more, subscribe to the channel.